Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H virtual event space. You are tuned in to learn to master photographing birds in flight with photographer Isaac Grant. Isaac, you've been around birding longer than many of us have had a camera in our hands. So we're going to get a lot of great images today, a lot of great tips. I'd like to welcome you back to the program. How's it going?
It's great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Always good to have you on. I know we have a lot of information to get to. I am going to remind everybody that if you do have any questions at all, feel free to get your questions and comments in. We're going to have you join us on live on YouTube. If you're watching there, drop your questions into the comment section. If you're joining us here on Zoom, you can use that wonderful Q&A tab that we have right there. Isaac, I'll turn it over to you and I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, thanks for having me. Thanks for taking the time to join. I'm Isaac Grant. You can visit my website, Isaac Grant Photography. Today we're going to talk about learn to master photographing birds in flight. Agenda, let's talk about me. We're going to talk about things to remember. And then we're going to talk about the technical side, techniques, technical info, and then how to implement those best practices in the field. What we're not going to talk about is identifying birds. This is on you. You need to be able to see a bird. You need to be able to identify it. We're not going to talk about specific camera brands or lenses. You can use any camera you'd like, any camera you're comfortable with, or any lens to be able to photograph birds in flight. We're not going to talk about exposure. You'll have to work on that. Make sure you know how to do it. Make sure that you're comfortable with your camera. We're not going to talk about perch birds, except in relation to photographing them once they take off. What we are going to talk about is the technical side of bird in flight shooting. We're going to talk about techniques to lock on to fast-moving birds. I'm going to talk about preparing yourself in the field for action. I'm going to talk about the importance of wind direction and then putting it all together. A little bit about me. I'm married to my college sweetheart, Roxanne, father of 2 boys, Lathan and Ryan, and I've got a really sweet dog named Luna. I was raised by a birder. Quick story, my dad was a birder. He was introduced to a man named Donald, who introduced him to his sister, who was my mother. So I kind of exist because of birding. I've been birding my whole life. I've traveled around the world birding. I know their calls, I know their habits, I know their behaviors. These are all tools that I can call on when I'm looking to go and photograph something. A little bit more about me. Top slide is, I've actually seen one more bird since then. I'm the #1 all-time most birds seen in Staten Island, where I live. #5 all-time for most birds seen in New York State. Again, these are not, that doesn't give you anything to get a better photo, except it gives you the knowledge to know how to implement that knowledge into getting a better photo. Talk gear. What I use a Sony A1. I use a Sony 600 f4 and a Sony 400 2.8. I can't say enough about the A1. It's small, it's fast, it's light. The autofocus is out of this world. To me, it's like science fiction compared to what I used to use. But any camera that you're comfortable with, certainly any camera brand out there is perfectly capable of taking fantastic birds in flight photos. This is just what for me is the best, what I'm comfortable with, and what I like to use. So I want to stress, photography is an art. And when we're taking birds in flight photos, we're still creating art. And we have to remember that and apply the techniques that we would use for any other type of photo to a birds in flight photo. So making sure that the bird is removed from the background and we have a nice, soft, beautiful background, making sure that we're on the proper sun angle so we don't have harsh shadows on the bird, making sure the sun is at our back, making sure we have the proper head angle. Again, the difficult part with birds in flight is not only do you have to have all of those things that you would normally work on the photo, but then you have to be able to capture peak action. So it's not easy, but we're going to talk about ways to make it easier. Before I get into that, we're photographing birds, so you really need to learn the birds, their calls, their habits, where and when to photograph them, what's the best time of year to photograph them. The more you know about birds, the more you know about the particular species you're trying to photograph, the more you can apply that knowledge to getting a better photo. I did another talk for B&H, and maybe they can link it in the chat, where I talked a lot about the importance of backgrounds and shooting angles and head angles and sun angle and the surroundings. So I get much more in depth in that talk, but I just also wanted to say that I'm eventually going to show a lot of photos after we get through some of the technical stuff. And you're going to see in each of these photos the same general theme. We're going to have a bird in sharp focus against a colorful, nice background. I don't really photograph birds in flight that are in the sky, meaning my background is the sky. I'm photographing them at eye level against the varied, complex, colorful background. And that's actually much more difficult because the cameras more or less use contrast to focus on something. And it's more difficult to get focus against the varied background, but this is what we're going to work on. So we'll go over some of the technical stuff now. First is setting up the camera. We need to set up the camera properly in order to get birds in flight shots. Basics. Regardless of the camera brand you use, you want to use AFC or AI servo. You want continuous autofocus. You want the camera to be able to continue to focus while you're holding down the shutter. You want to use the fastest shutter speed possible. There's mixed information out there about this. To me, I use at least 1/3200th of a second and much more if I can. The more shutter speed I have, the better. I shoot wide open on my lens. I think I have one shot in this presentation that wasn't shot wide open, and I'll explain why. Why do I shoot wide open? Because I get more shutter speed. It's very simple. I want shutter speed more than anything else. I need to get a sharp photo. So I will shoot wide open as much as I can, and I shoot in manual. Why do I shoot in manual? Because I want the focus, I'm sorry, not the focus, I want my exposure set on the bird. If you're using something like auto ISO and you're panning and you're at a background just lighter or darker, it's going to change based on the overall scene, not on the exposure on the bird. So I want to make sure that my bird is properly exposed at all times. So I'm controlling the shutter speed, the f-stop, and everything else. It's in my control 100% of the time. I never use auto ISO. I never use anything else other than manual. I use the fastest card possible. I highly, highly encourage people to use the fastest card that they can buy. It's very rare that you can run into buffer situations, but the A1, you can get about 150 shots off, and then it starts to buffer. So you want to be able to write as many images as you can before you hit that buffer. You never know when peak action will happen, when birds start fighting, when something is banking, when it's hunting, whatever is happening. You don't want to miss a photo because you were buffering. Lenses. I would say that use the longest lens that you can use that you're comfortable with, that you can handhold, not on a tripod. When you're doing birds in flight, you need to have mobility. You need to be able to pan. You need to be able to move quick. You need to be able to move up and down. You need to be able to move side to side. And whichever lens you can comfortably handhold is the one I encourage you to use. If you're using a zoom lens, like a 100-500 or a 200-600 type lens, though there is an advantage to those, because if it's somewhat difficult to acquire the bird in the frame, you can zoom out a little bit, find the bird, and then zoom in. If you're using a prime lens, then you've got to just be able to find it. But we'll get into some techniques for that. The other thing is, and you'll notice I typically have higher ISOs on my birds in flight shots. I'm not scared to push the ISO. I've spoken to people who've said things to me like, oh, well, I never go above 1250 ISO or 1600 because I have too much noise. If the point is to get a sharp photo of a bird flying, you need enough shutter speed to get the photo of the bird flying. You don't want to be limited by your ISO. the software is great. If it's Topaz or DxO or Lightroom, whichever you're using, they really clean up the images very well, where you shouldn't be held back from getting a sharp photo because of your ISO. So I have a slide here for Sony, for Nikon, and for Canon. The most important part of this, I'm not going to get into each one of the settings. You can pause this or go back and rewatch it and pause it or take a screenshot. The most important thing is I have two back buttons set up with custom functions. One is set up for center zone. So on the A1, you can set up for the full center zone. If it's Nikon, you can use the wide area. I forget what it's called for Canon. I've got it on the slide. The point is, if I'm pointing my camera at a larger, slower bird that I can make sure I can keep squared up in the center of the frame, I can just at any point pull up that back button. I have my bird eye autofocus on. If you have a camera that doesn't have bird eye autofocus, and say you're using a Nikon D500 or a D850, I would be in group. Otherwise, if I'm using a mirrorless camera like the A1 or a Z8 or an R5, I would be in a zone as long as it's a bird that's large enough to keep centered. If it's a smaller, more erratic bird, like a swallow or a shorebird or something that's fast and flying around a lot, my other button that I have a custom function set for would be in all focus points. It's called wide on Sony. It's called auto area on Nikon. You want to be able to pull up, depending on exactly what you need at the moment, either a zone or the all focus points, and with your eye tracking on as long as you have it. So here's a quick slide for Nikon. Again, you can just pause if that's what you're using. Here's a slide for Canon. Same thing. We have it on whole area autofocus, which should be selecting the zone. And you have it on whole area, I'm sorry, flexible zone and whole area, depending on if you're setting for larger, slower things that you can keep squared up in the center, or something really fast and erratic. So the focus limiter, I don't touch it. I have it set and I never think about it. It's set on full and it stays that way forever. I never touch it. The same goes with the IS. I keep it on 1 on my lens. I never touch it. I don't touch it if it's on a tripod, if it's off a tripod, if it's shooting birds in flight or not. I haven't found it makes any difference ultimately. But the reason I don't touch the focus limiter is because there are times you will miss opportunities when something is flying really close. You may be photographing something flying at a fixed distance, 15 feet, 20 feet, and then all of a sudden it turns towards you. If you have the limiter set for distance and it comes towards you, you're going to miss the photo. Now, there are times that having the focus limiter set can make it more difficult to acquire initial focus, because it's going to go through the range from close focus to infinity and back until it finds what you're looking for. So we're going to go over what I want you to do to avoid that becoming a problem. But here are some examples of why I keep the focus limiter on full always. This is a snowy owl. I was at the beach. I was photographing. Well, I was really just standing there waiting. The owl is about 200 feet away. There was a bunch of people around the owl, whereas in the dune, it was just comfortably sleeping. People weren't really close. But this owl in the evening would fly out and go towards the inlet to hunt. I knew that. So I positioned myself way far away from the bird, stood on the beach, thinking, okay, it's going to fly about here and then head towards the inlet. Turns out it flew right past me. This is basically a full frame image, just slightly cropped because it was leveled. I shot ISO 1250. This was shot on a Nikon D850 in group. If I had my A1, I would have shot it on center zone. And big, slow bird flying down the beach, easy enough to square up and keep in the center of the frame. But this was so close that if I had the focus limiter set to far focus, I wouldn't have been able to focus on this bird. Again, shot wide open f5.6, shutter speed 1/4000. It's another situation. It's a black skimmer. I was photographing skimmers as the sun came up on the ground. If you've ever spent time photographing skimmers, they do a lot of yelling and screaming and clapping at each other. And so I was photographing that. And then I said, let me try to get some birds in flight backlit as the sun was coming up. And this bird picked up and flew right in my face. This was full frame, only cropped to square. I have the wings as well. But again, if I had that focus limiter set, I would have missed this photo. As I spoke about, I shot this wide open at 4. My ISO was 1600. My shutter speed was 1/5000. Even though these birds are pretty big and pretty slow, when they're flying full speed directly into your face, you need shutter speed to freeze the action. So how you help yourself not lose shots because the focus limiter is set to full is by pre-focusing. Very important. What you want to do is figure out, anticipate the distance where the birds are going to be and focus on that distance so that when you lift the camera, it's already in the range, so you can then immediately snap into focus. So if you're waiting for a bird, a hawk or something to take off from a branch, just focus on that bird, focus on that branch, wait. If you're photographing shorebirds and they're coming in and landing on a sandbar, focus on that sandbar. If you're looking to photograph shorebirds that are flying by at the beach, focus on a wave or something at the distance where you anticipate them being, so that when you lift your camera, you already pretty much have the bird in the plane of focus, so that when you hit the shutter, you can lock on right away. It's very important that you continue to readjust as the distance that your bird is going to be changes. So I'm going to go over some examples of photos I was able to capture simply because I pre-focused. Here's a yellow-headed blackbird. I was in Utah. This was very close to sunset. This bird was feeding in tall grass. You couldn't see it. It would fly up, it would go into the grass, and then it would go maybe 20 or 30 feet further along, go back into the grass, and it was sort of following a pattern. So I realized if I put myself 20 feet past where it currently was, pre-focused on the distance where it was, as it burst out of the grass, because you didn't know when it was going to do it, because you couldn't see the bird, I would be able to just pick up the camera, be at the right distance, and lock onto it flying by. Again, very important, because if I needed to spend the time picking up the camera and then acquiring focus, I would have missed the opportunity. So by pre-focusing, it allows me to be right where I knew the bird was going to be, lock on focus. I'm wide open. I'm at f4. I'm going to continue to be wide open to get as much shutter speed as possible. I'm ISO 1600. My shutter speed was 1/5000. I was very close to this bird. This is not a large crop. This was, bursting out of the grass, get on it quick, move on. Here's a greater scaup, photographed in the winter. I was in waders, standing in the ocean next to a jetty. There was a flock of them just sort of sitting in the water, mulling around, and I was hoping to get flight shots. I had pre-focused on exactly where the birds were, at the ones that I thought would fly, so that when they did fly, I, again, could be on the bird. You didn't know when they were going to fly. They would just sort of get to the end of the jetty and sit there for 20 minutes, or they would just pick up and fly away and go feed. As the tide changed, they would go feed areas. So eventually all the birds that were there would go feed someplace else. So you had continued opportunities, provided you knew what they were going to do. And you were there because they were close, and it was a split second. They're landed, they take off. And I'm looking for the most dynamic pose. I'm looking for that powerful wings down pose. The bird's looking at me. I'm ISO 2000. This is very close to sunset. I'm wide open at 5.6 because I was shooting with a 600 and converter, and I had 1/4000 shutter speed. Now, more technical stuff. Practice panning. If you're shooting birds in flight, you have to make sure your focus limiter is the way you need it to be. You need to make sure you're pre-focused, and you need to be able to not only acquire the bird, but stay on the bird. So I always handhold. I mentioned this already. I'll say it again. What I do is I have my camera here. I'm going to step back for a second. I watch where the bird is. I move my body, not just my hands, and I move my body as the speed that the bird is going. And what you do is you continue to do that as you're lifting the camera, because when you're lifting the camera to photograph a bird in flight, you're not putting the camera where the bird is. Of course, you're anticipating where the bird is going to be. So you're moving your body as you're panning, and you continue at that same speed to lift it as you put the camera to your eye. So that when you put the camera to your eye, the bird is in the viewfinder. Now this takes practice. It's not easy. once you've done it for a long time, it becomes easier, of course. Also, when I'm doing that, I sort of get like a little stance where I lower my knees a little bit to get a sort of powerful stance. I take my elbow, I put it into my side, so I have a steady base. I'm panning, moving my body, and lift the camera, continuing to pan in the same speed as I put the camera to my eye, so that the bird is there. Again, it takes some time. I would say don't get frustrated, because it comes. Like anything, the more you practice, the better you get at it. So I'm going to show some photos where our basic panning techniques and how they help me get the photo. Here's a glossy ibis taken at a local rookery in New Jersey. You're standing on an elevated area. The birds are right out in the open. You can see them coming from a mile away. So this was, pick up the camera, lock on, wait for them to come in, so that when they come in and bank to land, I'm on there. But you need to be able to follow them along, so that when the action that you want happens, you're ready. This was taken with the Nikon D850, shot in group. Again, if I had my A1, I would have shot that in center zone with high autofocus on. I shot it wide open, 5.6. That was shot with the 500 PF, 1/3200th of a second. Slow bird, not very fast. Didn't need a ton of shutter speed. Here's another example, a white rum sandpiper. Now, if you know what a white rum sandpiper is, they're tiny and they're really fast. There was low tide. There was a sandbar exposed where I was. Birds were coming in to the edge of from where they were feeding. I'm sorry, it was high tide. They were coming in when their habitat was gone from the tide. They were coming and landing on a sandbar. So I positioned myself so I could follow the birds as they were coming in. And then as they were pulling up to land or banking to go around the sandbar, I'd be able to capture peak action. It's taken with the A1, F4. Again, I'm always wide open in these situations, or almost all wide open. 1250 shutter speed. I'm sorry, 1250 ISO, 6400 shutter speed. You need all the shutter speed you can get for small little fast birds like this. Can you get a sharp photo at a much slower shutter speed? Sure you can. I'd rather not risk it. If you have one or two close passes or something like that, for a difficult bird to photograph, I'm always going to make sure I have enough shutter speed. So where do I want you to start? Once you've gotten comfortable locking on to targets, you have your camera set the right way, you have your focus limiter set the right way, you can pick up the camera and have it in the bird in the viewfinder. It really helps to start with big, slow, easy birds. A spot where there's geese, a spot where there's ducks or gulls, or a place where kids go and throw bread. You have repeated opportunities. You can practice technique. You can practice panning. You can gain confidence. Once you can do that, then you move on to something a little bit more difficult. Say you can go, I live on the coast, so we have breeding colonies in the summer. You can go to a place where there's common terns, or if you live near puffins, or, well, they're smaller and faster. But any place that has a lot of birds with a lot of opportunities, so you can practice your technique, you can practice panning, you can be comfortable with the zones that you're shooting in, you can be comfortable where you can just don't have to think about it. It's second nature. You can pick up that camera and you can press the button that you need, and you can get that bird in your viewfinder and then get a photo. So let's start with the biggest and the slowest. Brown pelican. Doesn't get any bigger and slower. This was photographed in Florida, 2022. It was leading a photography tour. I'm actually going to be leading another one that I'll mention later. Hopefully you can join me. This was, we were photographing in the water. Now you might look at this and say, well, why was I at 1/6400 shutter speed for a brown pelican? There's two reasons. One, I was in the water, waist deep water. The tide was moving. So I was literally being pushed. The other is we were photographing pelicans as they were flying up and then diving. And I was trying to capture, and I have the photos, their beak right as it hit the water. And you need a lot of shutter speed to do that. So one reason I had the high shutter speed was because I was being pushed by the waves, and I wanted to make sure that there wasn't motion blur, because it was difficult to stay perfectly still when you're in the water. The other was I was trying to capture peak action right as the beak hits the water. Here's another relatively large, slow bird, an osprey. This was photographed near a nest. I wanted to photograph them because typically for osprey shots, you just see it against water. Nothing wrong with that, but I wanted something different. I wanted something with a nice green background. I wanted something with where the bird was close, the background was distant. This bird was actually not diving for food. It was diving for a stick for its nest. Again, relatively easy bird, large, close. Why did I need 6,400? Well, because I wanted the exact time again. I wanted it as right as it picked up the stick. So it's not difficult to get a sharp photo of the osprey, but when you want a specific moment, you want as much shutter speed as possible. Shot this in center zone, like I do now with all the large fast birds. If I was using a D850 or D500 or a 1DX or one of the older digital SLRs, I'd be using the center point and some surrounding points, because you can point it right at this bird's face and keep it there. Here's a red-tailed hawk, photographed near sunset. Again, wide open. Again, I have 1250 ISO. I have a close bird with a distant background, a field. Why did I have 6,400 shutter speed? 2 reasons. One, why not? I could. There's no reason not to. The second was I was photographing American kestrels, and they're much smaller and faster. And I was trying to get them as they were picking off grasshoppers. And so I needed a lot of shutter speed. And this red-tailed hawk just happened to fly by. So took advantage, got some photos as it took off out of a tree, had its wings spread. Again, the kind of shots I'm looking for. I want to go back to what I said earlier. We're making art, right? I'm always looking to get a beautiful dynamic pose on a nice sun angle with eye contact with the bird against a beautiful background. So let's talk wind direction. How does wind direction affect things? Well, the birds will typically take off and land into the wind. They need lift, so when they're taking off, they use the wind's lift to help them take off. And when they're landing, they use the wind to help slow them down. So if you're photographing in the morning and the sun is at your back, you want that wind at your back, or some component of at your back, maybe angled, east or west, up or north or south a little bit, but you want it at your back so that when the birds are coming into land or taking off, they're coming towards you. It's very important to pay attention to the weather, because if you've got a day with beautiful sun and the wind is in the opposite direction, then the birds are going to be taking away from you. They're going to be taking off away from you. They're going to be landing away from you. And you're going to have plenty of opportunities with the birds completely taking off in the wrong direction, which isn't what you want. So you want to line up that sun and wind direction so that you can have the birds doing what you want, which is flying towards you. This is an American kestrel. With a mouse, one of the American kestrels I told you I was photographing. Shot at 840 millimeters, again, wide open to 5.6. I was at ISO 1600, 6,400 shutter speed. This was landed on a sign, and I knew it was going to take off. It was a very windy day, so I knew when it took off, it was going to take off coming towards me. So I had the camera in center zone. The bird was right in, it was sitting on a sign, it wasn't moving, it was easy to get in center zone, and just waiting for it to start. Had my, had it on the eye autofocus like I always have it now, just holding, waiting, shutter half pressed, so that as soon as it takes off, I'm on the bird, I'm tracking it, and I get the shot I want. American oyster catcher, shortly before sunset, same thing. Sun was at my back, sun was coming from the west, the wind was coming from the west. The birds were coming into land and banking up before they landed. So I could track them from a long way off using the same techniques I talked about. I was pre-focusing, I pick up the camera, they're coming in, they're coming in, they're coming in. I have shots of them with wings up and wings down, but I wanted something where they're banking, banking facing me or banking facing away. The more dynamic, the better. So as I am pretty much always, I'm wide open, 840 millimeters, 1/6400th of a second. This is full frame, only cropped to square. So this bird was very close. So even though they were a fairly large, slower shorebird, they were really close to me, and I wanted as much shutter speed as I could get. So I got it. Again, I had perfect golden light, I have beautiful image quality. The little bit higher ISO doesn't scare me. I want the shot. This is a snail kite photographed on my Florida tour in 2022, taken from an airboat. And we were sort of in a cove, and the bird was landed in a tree. And I knew when it We had a slight wind at our back, and I knew when it took off, it was going to take off towards us. So we positioned the boat so that we could be lined up straight with this bird. Again, I am wide open. I had this set on center zone. Any of these big, fairly slow birds, I'm in center zone. And I have my eye tracking on, so it took off, it spread its wings. I'm at 3200th of a second because they're very large, slow moving hawks. So that was enough shutter speed for me. I have the kind of pose I want. And again, I'm going to keep saying this. I've got the right sun angle. I've got a nice, soft, colorful background. These are all birds against varied backgrounds, this being maybe the one exception because sort of half of the bird was against sky. So if the next thing I'm going to talk about is the bird's landed and you want to try to photograph it as it's taking off. You got to be ready, right? Like I just talked about with this American Kestrel. I had the wind at my back. I was focused. I had the shutter half pressed. I've already practiced all the other techniques. I'm ready. I'm watching for clues. If you watch certain birds before they're going to fly, they'll take a poop and lighten the load. Certain birds will preen and then stretch, do something. They don't always do it, of course, but you're looking for clues to make sure you're ready. And you want to anticipate that action. And most importantly is you want to frame the shot so the bird has room to fly into. If I have a bird that's facing to the right, I'm going to now switch from using the center zone to using all focus points. And what I'm going to do is move that bird all the way to the left edge of the frame. Again, the bird is facing to the right. I'm moving it all the way to the left edge. Because there's always going to be a delay, a lag between when that bird takes off and when you can physically react and press the shutter. So the camera will start autofocusing for you in that split second that it takes for you to actually react and move. So I've anticipated the action. I've got the camera where I want it to be, the bird is framed where I want it to be, so I can then capture peak action. Here's a California quail, a little smaller, faster. Again, shot wide open, 5.6. This was taken in Idaho. The bird was calling at the top of a sagebrush. I knew it eventually would fly. So I had it, just like I said, I had my camera picked up. I had the bird framed all the way to the left, figuring it's going to take off and fly to the right. So I was able to, this was, I think, the third photo that I got. It was wings down, wings up, and then wings down. And that's kind of that really powerful flying pose I really like with the feathers, the primaries all the way, sticking out like that. 6400th of a second. Again, I had plenty of light. I'm using all focus points. Let's go over another example. Royal tern photographed in Florida during the 2022 tour. There was a whole bunch of them just bathing right in front of me. Again, these are somewhat larger, second largest tern we have, fairly easy to focus on, and it wasn't moving, it was just taking a bath. So I took some pictures of it taking a bath and I said, well, now let me get some flight shots. So I used my center zone. I was waiting for it to take off. I made sure I had enough shutter speed to either capture peak action with wings up or wings down, and also to get the water splashes and the drops that are going all over the place. So wide open as usual, 5,000 shutter speed, ISO 1200. Here's a purple gallinule in flight. Not an easy bird to capture in flight. Not an easy bird to get against a clean background. Also photographed on my 2022 Florida tour. There was a patch of lily pads. There was open water and another patch, and the birds didn't want to be in the open water, so they were flying up to get from one side to the other. So I'm using all the techniques I've gone over. I was pre-focused. I used all focus points. I saw the bird get to the edge. I know it's going to take off, right? Because it didn't want to be in the open. So I have, in this case, the birds are going to the, they were going to the left. So I had the bird all the way on the right. I have all focus points. I had enough shutter speed, 1/4000th of a second. I'm wide open. I was able to catch the bird as it flew across in the open. And I have photos of this bird with its wings forward, the wings backwards as it's landing. Here's a white-tailed ptarmigan photographed top of a mountain in Utah. The bird was, in this case, moving to the left. I'm sorry, it was moving to the right. It had gotten to a rocky area where there was sort of a depression where I figured it's probably going to fly because it didn't want to jump down. And so I made sure I had plenty of shutter speed, wide open at f4. I'm using all focus points because it was going to then take off from where it was and go to the right. So I framed so the bird was on the left edge. I had all focus points. I had my bird eye autofocus on. I'm wide open. I got plenty of shutter speed because I'm from New York City. Spent very little time at the top of a mountain in Utah, and I didn't want to miss. I had golden perfect light. I had, beautiful image quality at 1250 ISO. I'm never going to let that limit me. And I want the best shot possible. I want those wings forward. He's calling. He's looking right at me. It's exactly the kind of photo I'm looking to get. This is a red-winged blackbird, photographed shortly after sunrise. ISO was higher because the light wasn't that strong yet. The bird was flying back and forth from a tree line to a stick that was out in the marsh. It was very obvious where it was going to go to and come from. Position the bird at the right edge of the frame. I have all focus points. I had plenty of shutter speed, 1/5000th, again, to get that powerful downstroke pose that I'm looking for. Next situation here would be direct flight, right? As opposed to a takeoff shot, something that's just flying by. Got to pay attention. Got to make sure you're pre-focused, like we've talked about. If you're using a mirrorless camera, turn off sleep mode. Just leave the camera on. Put a couple extra batteries in your pocket, leave it on, because you don't want to have that lag from the time it takes to turn the camera on to pick it up. If the camera isn't awake when you pick it up, you may lose photos. So I don't want that. So if I know I'm just shooting flight shots, I turn sleep off, make sure I have an extra battery or two in my pocket, and I get to work. I'm waiting for that peak action. Here's a willet photographed shortly before sunset. Birds were flying up and down a creek in the salt marsh. And so I was tracking them as they were going along. And at this point, the bird thankfully banked, which is just what I wanted to do. But this is pick up, pre-focus to the creek, track the bird as it's flying by, the same technique, moving your body, anticipating where it's going to be. And then once you're on, staying on it, waiting for peak action. Here's a Florida scrub jay. Photographed on my Florida tour in 2022. It was feeding on the ground, eating some kind of nuts. I don't know what those are, and flying back up into the trees, into the scrub. And it was pretty obvious where it was coming from and where it was going to. This is taken 600 millimeters. This is the one photo that I stopped down. I was at 5.6 because this again is just about full frame. The birds were right in front of us. I wanted a little more depth of field, and the background was the distant scrub, so I was fine with that. I had enough shutter speed, and I was able to track this bird. I used all focus points because they're smaller, they're faster, they're harder to keep centered up in the frame. In that case, I'm going to let the camera work for me. Here's the Wilson's phalarope, photographed in Utah, the Great Salt Lake. There's tens of thousands of them there. They're smaller, they're fast, they're hard to focus on. They're hard to keep in the frame. So in this case, I had really nice golden light. I wanted the photo of this bird against the lake was kind of dried up when I was there, against that kind of background. So I stood on an elevated rock wall and had a little bit of a higher shutter speed because I wanted to steady myself because I was standing sort of on an uneven rock wall, and also because I wanted to freeze peak action. All focus points, bird eye autofocus on. It's a green-winged teal, photographed shortly before sunset. The birds were going from one pond to another, and in between was a dried up pond, which is what this background is. So I was waiting for the birds to take off from one pond, tracking them as they went along until they got against the background that I wanted. That's when I fired away and let them go past. So the birds were flying along and then banking to get to this other pond. So 5.6 is wide open. I'm using all focus points at that point. These are really small and fast ducks, 1/4000 shutter speed. This is a black-necked stilt, again photographed on my Florida tour in 2022. Relatively slow shorebird, wasn't really going too quick, just going from one spot to another. There's plenty of opportunities to photograph these birds in flight, but same thing. I saw where it was flying from. knew where it was going to because there were other stilts there already. So it just was able to track it as going along. In this case, I didn't want a wings up shot because I wanted to see all the beautiful iridescence on the stilt. So let's move on to the end, which is smaller, faster, and more erratic birds. These are the birds that are like tough, where shutter speed is critical. 4,000, 3,000 can work on occasion, but you want as much shutter speed as possible. I'm always using all focus points at that point. And I want to be on the lookout for an opportunity. You know, if you're photographing swallows, there's some place where there's a lot of swallows where they're feeding, or they're coming to and from nest boxes, or you know, birds are flying to and from a feeder. Any sort of situation where you can get repeated opportunities is really going to help to capture these type of photos. So this is a tree swallow, photographed a little after sunrise. This is right, ISO 2000. I wanted as much speed as possible. This is not a large crop. I'm wide open to that 4. I had 10,000th of a second. It really helped me get that full-on banking, looking right at me, the kind of pose I'm looking for. All focus points. These are all on all focus points, except this photo. This is Addis hummingbirds, photographed in Arizona. I was there in late October, early November. There are very few flowers. I was at a feeder, and I wanted to be able to capture the birds fighting because I just didn't want one bird by itself with no flowers around. I'm looking to make a beautiful photo. So it took me 3 sessions to get this photo where both birds were in the same plane of focus, both had good eye contact looking at me. Wide open at 4, 1/6400th of a second, ISO 2000. So this was the only one of these small and fast birds that I didn't have on all focus points, and it was because they were above a feeder. So I knew exactly where they were going to be, and it was easy to square up. Here's a rough-winged swallow. ISO 2500, it was early in the morning. Nice field background. Again, this is the common theme. I'm always looking for a beautiful subject and a beautiful soft blurred background. I'm wide open at that 4, 1/6400th of a second. I'm using all focus points. I'm practicing. These birds are feeding over a pond and then coming and hunting over a field and then going back over the pond. So it's pretty easy to get on them from further away, track them as they're coming in, and then be able to get the photo that I wanted. Here's the barn swallow. This photo was taken with the D850 using all focus points. You can do it. You know, it's more difficult on an older digital SLR, but this is 9 frames a second. And just to mention, you always want to have as many frames a second as you can get, right? You're trying to capture peak action. If you can shoot at 20 frames a second, if you can shoot at 30 frames a second, if you can shoot at 9 or 10, whatever it is, shoot at that. You want as many chances as you can to capture peak action. So this was wide open, the 500 PF, 1/5000th of a second. Again, I want that full-on banking pose. Just a couple more. Tufted titmouse, shot wide open, 2000 ISO, 1/10,000th of a second. The birds were going from a tree line to a food source. I know where they were coming from. I knew where they were going to. It was just a matter of tracking them along the way. All focus points. You didn't know when they were going to take off. They're really small. They're really fast. So very difficult bird to photograph in flight, but the kind of bird you can get if you're using these techniques that I'm talking about. Here's a mountain bluebird photographed in Idaho. I was up at the top of a mountain. And the birds there was a family, 2 adults and 3 or 4 fledglings, and they were feeding on these rocks. And they were basically just flying from one rock to the next, and occasionally they would go up to a power line, then back to the rocks. So this is as this bird was taking off, wings spread, shot with the 400 2.8. I had beautiful golden evening light, 1/12,800th of a second. This was just about full frame, crop to square. Bird was very close at 400 millimeters. So you have a very limited time where you can react to it. So I have used all focus points. I framed the bird on the right edge of the frame, knowing it's going to fly to the left. Last photo I'm going to be showing is a warbling vireo. This bird was feeding in this tree. It would fly up and fly back. I wasn't expecting this bird to do this sort of banking pose when it did it. If I was expecting, I would have had more shutter speed. But I was ready for whatever it did, thinking it was just going to be hopping along, feeding along the tree. I had my camera on all focus points because it looked like it was going to do something. So I just moved my thumb to all the focus points and was able to track this bird as it flew off from the tree, bounced around, and came back. Again, tiny bird, super fast, super erratic. So just 3 takeaways. This is a combination of technique and art. You have to be comfortable with the camera, you have to use it as a tool, and you have to use that then to create the most beautiful photo you can get, the right light, the right background, the right pose. Got to be patient, you got to be ready. And you got to know that camera. It's got to be second nature. You have to know how those buttons are set. You have to know what you're going to do. You have to know how to pick it up, how to get the bird in the frame, and create a beautiful photo. So just wanted to thank you for spending time with me today. You can call me. My phone's always on. Please visit my website. It's a new website, isaacgrantphotography.com. You can visit my Instagram at Isaac A. Grant. And again, I mentioned I'm going to be running a tour to Florida where we're going to have lots and lots of birds and flight opportunities. All the information is on the website. Please join me if you can. You can reach out if you have any questions. And thank you.
Wonderful, Isaac. Thank you so much. We're going to open it up now for questions. We did drop Isaac's website in the chat. So if you guys are joining us on Zoom, it's right there in the chat. Or if you're joining us on the one of the other streams, we're going to drop it in the comments section there for you. We're going to get it started with a question from Helen joining us right here on Zoom. With your Nikon, do you use the 3D tracking?
Okay, so I have shot with 3D tracking. Again, I don't own a Z8 or a Z9. I've used it quite a few times. It's a little more complicated with the Z8 and Z9 and the 3D tracking. There are times when it seems to work and times when it seems that it doesn't work. And I'm not 100% comfortable with knowing exactly when those times are. But I would go between using all points and then 3D tracking to see which works best in your situation. Again, okay. I shoot with an A1 now. I've have friends that shoot with the Z8 and the Z9 exclusively. I've messed with it quite a few times. But I would say not enough to really know 100% when that 3D tracking is best.
Okay. And that's everything right there, right? You have to, you know, if the technology is only as good if you're very comfortable, and there's certain times when technology is not necessarily the best thing. There's certain situations when it's better to just go to what the system that you're used to using for years, or sometimes even going the old school route of focusing manually.
Well, that's tough. Yeah, but yes. Sure. Yeah.
Birds in flight, maybe not, but yes. We have a question from Samuel joining us here on Zoom asking, isn't panning supposed to be shot with a low shutter speed? How is panning different when it relates to birds in flight than what most people are used to panning, which is larger objects on the ground?
Oh, well, you know, the point is to get a photo of a bird flying, right? So you need to be able to track it as it's flying along. You know, if you're stationary and the bird is moving, you're not going to be able to keep that bird in the frame. So you need to be able to move along with the bird. That's it. I mean, the simple answer is you need to be able to pan along with that bird to track it so that it's in the frame, regardless of what it's doing, flying up and down, side to side, in and out. You got to stay on it. Otherwise, you don't have a bird photo.
Yeah. And for those who have tried panning, you'll realize that panning is in direct relation to the speed of whatever object you're capturing. If you're capturing somebody on a bike, a slower shutter speed is going to work because the bike is traveling much slower than if you're trying to pan a falcon that is darting through the air, and you're not going to be able to hold steady with the path of their flight for a 3-second long exposure to drag the shutter on that. So yeah, so a lot of it relates to the subject that you're shooting.
Yes, right.
Question coming in from YouTube. How do you set your ISO? Do you ever use auto ISO or do you manually set your ISO, Isaac?
Oh, yeah, I covered that. I never use auto ISO. I don't want the camera telling me anything that it thinks. I want to set the exposure based on looking in the camera and making sure that the bird is properly exposed. I'm not as concerned about the background because I can adjust that. Because again, you've seen all the photos. The photos are typically, going to have soft, blurred backgrounds. If it's a little bit too bright, that can easily, in post-processing, I can bring that down a little bit. I can lower the highlights. I can do something. But I want the best possible image quality on my bird. I want it properly exposed. And so I'm setting not for the whole scene. I'm setting for the bird. And for that case, I never use auto ISO. I keep it on manual 100% of the time.
Perfect. Another question coming in from YouTube. About how many shots do you wind up taking to get the one shot you're looking for?
Oh, that's tough. That's a tough answer, right? If it's a swallow, a lot, right? Once in a while, you get lucky. If I'm going to photograph a swallow, the A1 can do 30 frames per second in a compressed RAW. I put it on 30 frames a second, and I also have a button custom set to pull that menu up in a split second. I put it on as many frames per second as I can get, and you might shoot a whole morning and not get the shot you want. You know, there are times I've shot 1,500 shots and not gotten the shot I wanted. I mentioned it took me 3 sessions to get 2 hummingbirds in focus at the same time with good eye contact and good wing angles, because there was a million fights and they were always out of the plane of focus, and one was in focus and one isn't, or one was facing away. And there are times you get luckier. You know, a snail kite on the Florida tour was, I took 2 or 3 photos and got a perfectly exposed shot. It was just flew right at me. I knew where it was going to go. It was in a cove. It was going to fly out of the cove directly to where I was. So it really depends on the species and how difficult the species is. Obviously, the smaller, the faster, more erratic birds take more photos to get the one you want.
Okay. Now, we had another question come in regarding ISO. Now, I know you mentioned you're not afraid of letting that ISO climb up, which tells me that you're really focused on shutter speed, and shutter speed sounds like it's really the one out of the exposure triangle. It sounds like you're really focused on capturing that really fast shutter speed. Your ISO is going to be hinged upon that shutter speed. Mervat is asking, how do you choose the right ISO in manual? Is it strictly based on what shutter speed you need to accomplish?
Yeah, well, depending on the camera you have, right? I mean, if with an A1, you can see the exposure in the camera, right? With a Z8 or 5 or any of the mirrorless cameras, you can see it. So if I know I need 1/5000th shutter speed, then I have to move my ISO to whatever it needs to be to have proper exposure. If you're using an older digital SLR, well, you kind of need to do the same thing, except you're looking at the back of the camera. Right? You know, you're taking a test shot. Okay, what's my exposure look like? Okay, I'm good. So the answer is the only way you know is by seeing it. And of course, the more you shoot, the more you get used to what certain lighting conditions are. You can approximate where you're going to be, but you need to see it. And certain birds are harder than other birds. Certain birds are black and white, like that black-necked stilt that I showed. There are other birds that are a little bit more difficult exposure birds, where you have to sort of compromise. Your whites would be a little hot, your blacks would be a little bit dark, but you're in between, where when you're in post-processing, you can tone some highlights and raise some shadows and get a properly exposed bird. So it really depends on the bird and the light. But the answer is you need to know what shutter speed you need to get a sharp photo, and then adjust the f-stop, which in my case, I'm not really moving because I'm wide open, but you're adjusting your ISO in order to be able to have proper exposure for that shutter speed.
And Lisa here on Zoom is asking if you could please expand on how you pre-focus.
Yeah, very simple. Like if the bird is 30 feet away, focus on something 30 feet away. Just, lift the camera and point it to where the bird is. If it's perched, if you can see the bird, focus to something 30 feet away. If the bird is 40 feet away or 50 feet away, focus about that distance. If you're standing on a cliff and trying to photograph a peregrine falcon, try to focus on something. You may not be able to focus on something 40 feet away where the bird's going to be, because there might just be sky or the ocean below. So try to approximate what that 40 feet would be to your left or to your right on something, so that when you need to pull up where the bird is going to be, it's in the right focal plane or really close. And when it's really close, then the camera's autofocus can lock onto it, as opposed to it being way off. If you need to focus on something that's 50 feet away and you're focused on something that's 12 feet away, it's going to hunt, and it's going to take much longer time to actually acquire focus.
Perfect. Well, Isaac, I want to thank you. That does it for the questions there. A ton of information, some beautiful, beautiful images. We did drop Isaac's website there. So go check out the website, check out the photography tours, give him a follow on Instagram. If you guys do have any questions, reach out. Of course, we're going to have this available for you watching whenever you'd like on YouTube. So head over to B&H Event Space on YouTube, and you can watch this and all of our other content whenever you want. Isaac, huge thank you to you for joining us once again, and to all of our viewers. As always, can't do it without you. We do it for you. But that's it. Another round of the B&H Virtual Event Space in the books. Catch y'all next time.